Chapter 1. The Silence After. The house at the end of Willow Lane had once echoed with the sounds of laughter and the pitter-patter of tiny feet. But now, its walls were silent, save for the occasional creak and groan that all old houses seem to make, as if they're settling into their foundations, weary from standing so long. Claire stood in the doorway of the nursery. The soft pastel colours and the mobile still hanging above the crib, mocking her with memories of a time that now seemed like a distant dream. She had been living in a state of suspended animation since the funeral. The world continued to turn. The seasons changed from fall to winter. But for Claire, time might as well have stopped the day she lost her daughter, Emily. Her husband, Michael, had moved out shortly after, unable to cope with the constant reminders of their loss. The divorce papers sat unopened on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder of yet another chapter of her life coming to an end. The house felt too large for one person, filled with too many memories that echoed off the empty walls. Claire tried to keep busy, throwing herself into her work from home, avoiding the silence that seemed to press in on her whenever she stopped moving. But the quiet always found her, in the early hours of the morning or late at night when sleep eluded her. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Claire first noticed something was amiss. She had gone downstairs for a glass of water, the wooden floorboards cold under her feet. When she passed the living room, she paused. A photo album that she had left on the coffee table was now on the floor, its pages splayed open. She frowned, certain she hadn't left it like that. She picked it up, flipping through the photos of happier times, a sharp pang of grief hitting her. Shaking her head, she attributed the misplaced album to her own forgetfulness. Grief could do strange things to the mind, she reasoned. But as the days passed, more odd occurrences followed. She'd find kitchen cabinets open that she was sure she had closed, lights turned on in rooms she hadn't entered, and faint whispers that ceased as soon as she tried to listen. Claire told herself she was imagining things, the result of too many sleepless nights and the weight of her sorrow. She didn't dare mention it to Michael. She could already hear his response, telling her she was letting her grief get the best of her, suggesting, not for the first time, that she should consider counselling. But as the strange occurrences continued, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, holding her captive with its unseen forces. She knew she couldn't ignore it forever, but confronting the reality of her situation was a step she wasn't yet ready to take. So, she did the only thing she could. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and told herself it would all be okay. Tomorrow, she would figure it out. But tonight, she just needed to make it through the night. Chapter 2. Unsettled Beginnings. The light of dawn filtered softly through the curtains of Claire's bedroom, casting a gentle glow on the walls. Despite the promise of a new day, the sense of unease that had taken root in her chest the night before lingered, like a stubborn fog that refused to lift. She lay in bed for a moment longer, steeling herself for the day ahead. The odd occurrences around the house had escalated from mere annoyances to a source of constant worry, and Claire knew she could no longer afford to dismiss them as products of her imagination. As she made her way downstairs, the house greeted her with its usual silence, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. She prepared her coffee, moving through the motions mechanically, her thoughts elsewhere. It was only when she reached for the sugar that she paused, a frown creasing her brow. The canister was not in its usual spot next to the coffee machine, but on the opposite counter. Claire was certain she hadn't moved it. She was meticulous about keeping things in order, a habit that had become almost a coping mechanism in recent months. Trying to shake off the unease, Claire decided to spend her morning working in the home office. The distraction, she hoped, would help calm her nerves. Yet, as she settled at her desk, the sense of being watched crept over her, so tangible that she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone there. But the room was empty, save for the usual clutter of papers and books. The day dragged on, each tick of the clock amplifying Claire's anxiety. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And happen it did. As evening approached, Claire was in the living room, trying and failing to lose herself in a novel, when a sudden chill filled the room. The temperature had dropped significantly, causing her to wrap her arms around herself. It was then that she heard it. A soft giggle, unmistakably a child's, coming from the direction of the hallway. Her heart froze, the book slipping from her hands and landing with a soft thud on the floor. Claire stood, her body rigid with fear, as she listened intently. But the sound did not come again. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy with implications she dared not contemplate. Gathering her courage, Claire walked towards the hallway, each step echoing ominously in the quiet house. She reached the nursery, the door slightly ajar as she had left it. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, half expecting to find something, anything, that would explain the eerie laughter. But the room was as she had left it, untouched and painfully empty. The mobile hung motionless above the crib, the stuffed animals on the shelf gazing back at her with glassy eyes. There was no sign of anyone having been there. Feeling a mixture of relief and mounting dread, Claire retreated to the living room. The events of the day weighed heavily on her mind, a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. The misplaced items, the sudden drop in temperature, the child's laughter, all of it pointed to something beyond her understanding, something that defied explanation. As night fell, Claire was left with a sinking realization that whatever was happening in her house was not just a figment of her grief-stricken mind. The disturbances were real, and ignoring them was no longer an option. She needed to find answers, but the thought of delving into the unknown filled her with an apprehension she could scarcely admit to herself. Yet, she knew one thing for certain. The peace she had once found within these walls was shattered, and reclaiming it would require facing the shadows that now seemed to lurk in every corner. Chapter 3. Denial and Desperation. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, the steam swirling up like the thoughts in her mind, chaotic and unbidden. The strange occurrences in her home had not abated. If anything, they had become more frequent, more bold. Items not just misplaced, but appearing in entirely different rooms. The sound of footsteps when she was certain she was alone. And once, a chilling whisper of her name that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. She had tried to share her fears with Michael during one of their brief, strained phone calls, hoping for a sliver of understanding, or at least a shared concern for the oddities plaguing their home. But his response had been as cold as the distance between them. "Claire, you're letting your imagination run wild," Michael had said, his voice laced with a frustration that bordered on disdain. "You're alone in that big house, mourning Emily, and I think it's starting to affect you more than you realize." His words, meant to be rational, felt like a dismissal, a denial of her experience that stung with betrayal. He suggested, not for the first time, that she should see someone about her grief, implying her experiences were nothing more than figments of her distressed mind. The conversation had ended with a hollow goodbye, leaving Claire more isolated than before. The thought that her own husband believed she was losing her grip on reality was a bitter pill to swallow. But the occurrences in the house were real, weren't they? They had to be. With Michael's words echoing in her head, Claire began to question herself. Was she allowing her grief to morph into paranoia? Was the loneliness of the house, once filled with the laughter of her daughter and the presence of her husband, now breeding sinister shadows in the corners of her mind? Determined to find some grounding, Claire decided to take Michael's advice, though not for the reasons he had suggested. She wouldn't seek a grief counsellor to discuss her supposed hallucinations, but to prove to herself and to Michael that she was in control, that the occurrences in the house were not the manifestations of her sorrow. That afternoon she made the call, her voice steady as she requested an appointment with a local therapist. It felt like a step forward, albeit a small one, in regaining some semblance of control over her life. But as she hung up the phone, the house around her seemed to press in closer, the air charged with an unseen tension. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the house, or whatever resided within it, was aware of her plans and disapproved. She pushed the thought aside, chiding herself for letting her imagination get the better of her once again. She would see the therapist, discuss her grief, and perhaps, in the process, find a logical explanation for the disturbances. But deep down, Claire knew that understanding her grief wouldn't explain away the cold spots in the hall, the shadowy figures in the corner of her vision, or the feeling of being watched. No, those were questions for another day, questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. For now, she would focus on proving to Michael, and more importantly to herself, that she was not coming undone. Chapter 4. Seeking Answers. The decision to seek professional help, although made in defiance, brought Claire a semblance of relief. It was a step towards something resembling normalcy, a path that she hoped would lead her out of the tangled mess her life had become. However, the unsettling occurrences within the walls of her home refused to abate, serving as a constant reminder that her problems might not be entirely rooted in grief. After her first session with the therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, who listened more than she spoke, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. Dr. Harper had suggested various coping mechanisms and assured Claire that grief could manifest in myriad ways, including causing one to sense things that might not be there. Yet, Claire couldn't shake the conviction that what she was experiencing went beyond the scope of normal grief. Determined to find a logical explanation for the disturbances, Claire began to research the history of her house. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers, property records, and any documents she could find that might shed light on her home's past. It was a welcome distraction, a tangible problem she could tackle that didn't revolve around her crumbling marriage or the gaping hole left by Emily's absence. Her research revealed that the house was built in the early 1900s, passing through the hands of several families over the decades. There were no records of tragic events or anything that might suggest a reason for paranormal activity. Disappointed but not deterred, Claire decided to take a more direct approach. She contacted a local paranormal investigation group, a small team of enthusiasts with a shared interest in the supernatural. They were intrigued by Claire's experiences and agreed to spend a night in her home, bringing an array of equipment designed to detect any unusual activity. The night of the investigation was fraught with tension. Claire watched as the team set up their equipment, feeling a mix of skepticism and hope. As the hours passed, the investigators recorded several unexplained temperature drops and captured what they claimed were irregular electromagnetic field, EMF, readings. However, the night passed without any dramatic occurrences, and the evidence they collected was inconclusive at best. Despite the lack of definitive proof, the investigation provided Claire with a sense of validation. She was not alone in her belief that something unexplainable was happening in her home. The team suggested she keep a detailed log of any further incidents and offered to return if the activity escalated. Claire lay in bed that night, the silence of the house more pronounced than ever. The visit from the paranormal investigators had disrupted the usual rhythm of the unexplained occurrences, leaving her with a strange sense of anticipation. She realized she had been holding her breath, waiting for something to happen, but the night remained undisturbed. The investigation had not provided Claire with the answers she had hoped for, but it had sparked a determination within her. She would continue to seek explanations, to document the happenings in her home in the hopes of finding a pattern or a cause. And while part of her longed for a rational explanation, another part of her feared what she might discover if she delved too deeply. For now, Claire resolved to focus on her therapy sessions, to rebuild the pieces of her life that she could control. The mystery of her house would remain, lurking in the shadows, but she would not let it consume her. She would find a way to coexist with the unknown, even as she searched for the truth. Chapter 5. Isolation. As the days turned into weeks, Claire found herself sinking deeper into a solitary existence within the confines of her house. Her interactions with the outside world were limited to her therapy sessions with Dr. Harper and the occasional email exchange with the paranormal investigation group. Michael's calls had become sporadic, and when they did talk, the conversations were perfunctory, focused solely on the logistics of their impending divorce. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams and aspirations, had become a vast, empty space, filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed. The odd occurrences continued, growing in intensity. Objects moved with increasing frequency, and the whispers in the night evolved into discernible voices, murmuring indistinct phrases that left Claire with a sense of dread. She meticulously documented each event, hoping to find a pattern or some logic in the madness. Yet, as the pages of her journal filled, the reality of her situation became undeniable. She was living in a haunted house. Despite her initial resolve, the relentless nature of the disturbances began to wear on Claire. Sleep became elusive, and the dark circles under her eyes bore witness to her growing exhaustion. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but the thought of leaving the house, of abandoning the last vestige of her family, was unbearable. The isolation took its toll on Claire's mental health. Friends who had once offered a shoulder to cry on slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with the depth of her grief and the bizarre tales of her haunted home. Claire couldn't blame them. She could hardly believe it herself. The one person who might have understood, who might have shared in her fear, was too consumed by his own grief and anger to offer any solace. In a moment of desperation, Claire reached out to Michael, not to accuse or demand, but to simply talk, to share the burden of their loss and the strange happenings that had become her daily reality. But Michael's response was curt, a stark reminder of the chasm between them. "Claire, "I think it's time you consider selling the house," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It's not good for you to be there alone, especially not in your state of mind." His words, meant to be practical, felt like a betrayal. The house was all she had left of Emily, of their family. To leave would be to lose her daughter all over again. Claire's refusal to consider selling the house only served to widen the gap between her and Michael. He suggested more forcefully this time that she increase her therapy sessions, hinting at the possibility of psychiatric evaluation if her condition didn't improve. Feeling more alone than ever, Claire turned her focus inward, retreating further into the safety of her home, her fortress against the world that had failed her. She continued her research into the paranormal, clinging to the hope that understanding the forces at play might offer her some control, some way to reclaim her life from the chaos that had enveloped it. But with each passing day, the house seemed to grow more restless, more demanding of her attention. The whispers became shouts, the shadows took on menacing forms, and Claire found herself caught in a battle she was ill-equipped to fight. The line between the living and the dead blurred, leaving her to wonder if she too was becoming a ghost, haunting the remnants of her own life. Chapter 6. A Glimmer of Hope. Amid the relentless turmoil of her haunted home and the fraying threads of her once familiar life, Claire clung to her therapy sessions with Dr. Harper as a lifeline. These meetings became her sole anchor to reality, a place where she could voice her fears without judgment. Dr. Harper, ever patient and empathetic, suggested that Claire might benefit from joining a support group for individuals dealing with loss. Initially resistant, the idea of sharing her pain with strangers seemed daunting to Claire, who had grown accustomed to her isolation. However, the prospect of connecting with others who might understand her grief, if not the paranormal aspect of her struggles, eventually persuaded her. The support group met weekly at a local community centre, a nondescript building that Claire had passed countless times without a second thought. Walking into her first meeting, she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach, the kind that comes from stepping into the unknown. The group was small, a collection of faces marked by the same kind of sorrow that she saw in the mirror each day. As she listened to their stories, Claire realized that while their experiences were unique, the underlying thread of loss bound them together in a tapestry of shared pain. For the first time in months, Claire felt a sense of belonging. Here, she could speak of Emily, of her love and her loss, without the fear of being seen as unhinged or broken. She didn't mention the disturbances at home. That was a bridge too far, even here. But in speaking of her daughter, of the life they had shared, Claire found a modicum of peace. Encouraged by Dr. Harper, Claire began to explore various coping mechanisms to deal with her grief and the stress caused by the inexplicable events at home. Meditation and journaling offered solace, and while they didn't stop the occurrences, they provided Claire with a way to center herself, to find moments of calm in the storm. As the weeks passed, Claire's connection with the group deepened. She learned their stories, their hopes, and their regrets. And in doing so, she began to see her own situation with new eyes. Yes, her home was haunted, and yes, her marriage had crumbled under the weight of their shared loss. But she was not alone in her pain. The realization was a bittersweet comfort, a reminder that while grief was a universal language, it spoke to each person in a unique voice. One evening, after a particularly moving session, Claire returned home with a sense of resolve. The house seemed to greet her with its usual repertoire of creaks and whispers. But for the first time in a long while, Claire felt a flicker of defiance. She was tired of being a victim in her own home, tired of letting her grief and fear dictate her life. She began to approach the disturbances with a new perspective, viewing them as a puzzle to be solved rather than a curse to be endured. Claire started to document not just the events themselves, but her feelings and reactions to them, searching for any correlation that might provide clues to their cause. In this process, Claire discovered a surprising sense of empowerment. Each unexplained event, each eerie whisper, became less a source of terror and more a challenge to be met. And while she was far from understanding the nature of the haunting, the act of facing it head-on provided a small measure of control over the chaos that had consumed her. The support group, her therapy sessions, and her new approach to the disturbances at home formed a trifecta of coping strategies that slowly but surely began to rebuild Claire's sense of self. She was still haunted, both by the loss of Emily and the spirits within her house. But she was no longer adrift in her sorrow. There was a long road ahead, filled with uncertainty and likely more heartache. But for the first time since her daughter's death, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. She had found a way to navigate her grief, to live alongside it, and in doing so, she had taken the first steps towards healing. Chapter 7. Breaking Point. The newfound strength Claire garnered from her support group and therapy sessions infused her days with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Emily's passing. Yet, the haunting of her home escalated as if in direct opposition to her growing resilience. Objects not only moved, but were thrown with force. Doors slammed shut in the dead of night. And the once indistinct murmurs grew into voices so clear they could no longer be dismissed as the wind or the house settling. The entity, or entities, that dwelled within seemed determined to make their presence known. One evening, as Claire sat in the living room trying to lose herself in a book, a sudden chill permeated the air, and the atmosphere thickened with an unspoken malevolence. The lights flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Then, the whispers started, converging into a singular, discernible voice that called her name with a desperation that turned her blood to ice. It was a breaking point, a moment so charged with fear and clarity that Claire knew she could not continue to live this way. The decision to confront Michael came with the dawn. Sleepless and driven by a mixture of anger, desperation, and a sliver of hope that he might finally believe her, Claire called him, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We need to talk," she said, leaving no room for argument. "In person." Michael's agreement to meet was reluctant, his voice laced with the same skepticism that had driven a wedge between them. They agreed on a neutral location, a coffee shop where they had once spent lazy Sunday mornings dreaming of their future. Sitting across from Michael, Claire felt a pang of nostalgia for what they had lost, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of her plight. She recounted the recent events, the escalation of the haunting, and the toll it was taking on her mental and physical health. She spoke of her fear, not just for her safety, but for her sanity. The details poured out, each one a testament to the nightmare her life had become. Michael listened, his expression a mask that gave nothing away. When she finished, there was a heavy silence, the kind that speaks volumes. Finally he spoke, his words measured and rational. "Claire, I don't know what to say. I can't deny your experiences, but I can't understand them either. Have you considered, maybe it's time to let the house go?" His suggestion, though not unexpected, hit Claire like a physical blow. The house was her last connection to Emily, to the dreams they had shared as a family. Yet, in her heart, she knew he was right. The realization that she was clinging to a place that had become a source of torment was a bitter pill to swallow. The conversation that followed was difficult, but for the first time in months, it was honest. They discussed the logistics of selling the house, the division of their assets, and the legalities of their divorce. It was a surreal experience, planning the end of their life together amidst the ruins of their shared dreams. Leaving the coffee shop, Claire felt a mix of emotions. Relief that she had finally shared the burden of her haunted home with Michael. Sadness for the definitive end it signified for their relationship. And a flicker of hope that moving on from the house might bring some semblance of peace. The decision to sell was not an easy one, but it was necessary. Claire understood that in order to heal, to truly move forward, she needed to let go of the past, no matter how painful. The house had once been a symbol of their family's future, but now it stood as a monument to their loss and her torment. Chapter 9. Revelations. In the aftermath of her decision to sell the house, Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of liberation from the chains that had bound her to a place of sorrow and fear. But the house, it seemed, had one last secret to unveil, a revelation that would turn her understanding of the past few months on its head. It began with a decision to install security cameras around the property, a measure suggested by a member of her support group as a way to document the paranormal activities for potential buyers. Claire was skeptical, but desperate for any semblance of control over the situation. She needed to prove, if not to Michael then to herself, that she wasn't succumbing to grief-induced hallucinations. The installation was quick, and the cameras, discreetly placed, monitored the key areas of the house. Claire watched the feeds for days, expecting at any moment to catch a glimpse of the unseen forces that had tormented her. Instead, what she found was far more disturbing. Late one evening, as she reviewed the footage, she saw a figure moving through the living room. It was not the spectral presence she had anticipated, but a very real, very familiar one. Michael. The timestamp showed it was late at night, long after he had any reason to be there. Claire watched in disbelief as he moved around the room, pausing to adjust the position of a vase, to open a window, to unsettle a stack of books. It was all too deliberate, too purposeful. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The disturbances, the sense of being watched, the voices. Had it all been Michael? But why? What could he possibly gain from driving her to the brink of madness? The questions swirled in her mind as she confronted Michael, armed with the footage. His initial denial crumbled under the weight of evidence, and the truth, when it came, was a twisted knife in an already gaping wound. Michael confessed to orchestrating the hauntings, driven by a concoction of guilt, grief, and a desperate desire to regain control. "I grew up in this house," Michael justified. "My father grew up in this house. If I can't stand to live here, what makes you think you deserve to?" In his twisted logic, he believed that by making the house uninhabitable, Claire would be forced to sell, to move on from the memory of their daughter and the life they had lost. He hadn't anticipated her resilience, her determination to cling to the remnants of their past. The betrayal was profound, more devastating than the haunting itself. Claire had battled against unseen forces, against her own mind, only to discover the source of her torment was the person she had once trusted above all others. The aftermath of Michael's confession was a blur of legal proceedings and painful decisions. The house was sold, the divorce finalized, and Claire found herself adrift, untethered from the anchors of her past. But within that turmoil, there was a glimmer of something new, a sense of clarity, of understanding. Claire realized that her strength lay not in the home she had fought so hard to preserve, but in her ability to face the unimaginable, to endure and to emerge, battered but not broken. The journey through grief and betrayal had taught her that the ghosts of the past, whether real or conjured, could not define her future. As she stood at the threshold of a new beginning, Claire knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she also knew that she possessed the resilience to face them, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her shattered dreams. The revelations of the past months had stripped away the illusions that had once clouded her vision, leaving her with a stark, unflinching understanding of herself and those around her. In the end, the house on Willow Lane was just a setting for a chapter of her life that had closed. Claire was ready to turn the page, to step into a future unhaunted by the spectres of her past. Chapter 10. Liberation and New Beginnings. The final chapter of Claire's ordeal began with the closing of a door, the heavy, ornate door of the house on Willow Lane, which had been both her sanctuary and her prison. As she walked away for the last time, the deed to the house now in the hands of new owners, she felt an odd mixture of sorrow and relief. The house had been a symbol of so much: love, loss, betrayal. But as she put distance between herself and its imposing facade, Claire felt the ties that bound her to her past loosening. In the weeks that followed, Claire embarked on a journey of self-discovery and healing. The sale of the house and the settlement of her divorce provided her with the means to start anew. But the true challenge lay in rebuilding her sense of self, her identity beyond the roles of wife and mother that had defined her for so long. She took time to grieve, not just for Emily, but for the life she had thought she would have. She allowed herself to feel the full breadth of her anger and betrayal, to confront the shadows that had lingered in the corners of her heart. And then, slowly, she began to let them go. Claire found solace in her support group, in the shared experiences and understanding of those who had also walked through the valley of loss. She volunteered her time, finding purpose in helping others navigate their grief. It was through this work that she began to see the possibility of a future, one not defined by the tragedies of her past. As the seasons changed, bringing with them the promise of renewal, Claire took the first tentative steps towards a new beginning. She moved into a small apartment, a place filled with light and void of memories. She decorated it with care, choosing each piece not for its connection to her past, but for the comfort and joy it brought her in the present. Claire also returned to her passion for painting, a hobby she had abandoned in the midst of her grief. The blank canvases became a medium for her expression, a way to process her emotions and to capture the beauty she was beginning to see in the world again. With each stroke of her brush, she felt a little more of the darkness lift, replaced by colour and light. The journey was not easy. There were days when the weight of her losses threatened to drag her back into the depths of despair. But Claire had learned the value of resilience. She leaned on her support network, on the coping strategies she had developed, and most importantly, on the strength she had found within herself. In the end, Claire realized that liberation came not from the absence of pain, but from the ability to move forward in spite of it. She had faced the unimaginable, had been brought to the brink, and had found her way back. The scars of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. As the story closes, Claire stands at the edge of a new chapter in her life, one filled with possibilities. She is not the same woman who entered the house on Willow Lane, burdened by grief and haunted by loss.
If you like this audiobook, please like and subscribe and leave a comment.